Okay. Well, welcome, noble ones, to this, which is a second episode of, I want to say, what appears to be a series, since you like it, of me reacting and also providing further commentary and perhaps even a little bit of an analysis today on Lex Fridman's podcast. The video in question we're responding to today is, of course, the one where Lex interviewed Graham Hancock. And, of course, we're discussing the hypothesis that Mr. Hancock presents, which is basically a proposition that there may have been an advanced Ice Age prehistoric civilization predating our current historiographical record. Now, all of this is, of course, fascinating, and I'm always ready to listen to all sorts of hypotheses and discussion about what the past was, particularly when we go all the way back to frigging 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. Now, clearly, this is section 2, so if you haven't, please go check out the first episode before you watch this one, because on that one, we actually checked out the introduction and the first 2 sections. So today, we're going to start from section 3. You'll find a link in the description below, and without further ado, let's jump in.
Is. And perhaps we should also state, if we look at the entirety of history of hominids, humans or hominids have been explorers. I didn't even know this when I was preparing for this.
Yeah.
Looking at Homo erectus.
Yeah.
1.9 million years ago.
Absolutely.
Almost right away, they spread out through the whole world.
Yeah.
And we, Homo sapiens, evolved from them. And we should also mention, since we're talking about sort of controversial debates going on, as I understand, there's still debates about the dynamics of all that was going on there. Like we mentioned in Africa, that it's, I think the current understanding, we didn't come from one particular point of Africa, that there's multiple locations.
This is the out of Africa theory. I think
Yes.
it's more than a theory. It's really strongly evidenced. Why? Because we're part of the great ape family, and it's an African family.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that human beings, our deep origins are in Africa. But then there, as you rightly say, there were these very early migrations out of Africa by species that are likely ancestral to anatomically modern humans, including definitely Homo erectus and the astonishingly distant travels that they undertook. Yes, I think there is an urge to explore in all of humanity. I think there is an urge to find out what's around the next corner, what's over the brow of the next hill, and I think that goes very deep into human character. And I think it was being manifested in those early adventures of people who left Africa and traveled all around the world, and then settling in different parts of the world. I think a lot of anatomically modern human evolution took place outside Africa as well, not only in Africa.
So I guess the general puzzlement that you're filled with is, given that these creatures explore and spread and try out different environments, why did it take hundreds of thousands of years for them to develop complicated society settlement?
Interesting, because I was actually looking for the connection with the lost advanced Ice Age civilization there, because all of this is like, okay, yeah, we have been exploring for a very long time. How does that connect? So that was a very good follow-up question to that introduction. Let's see how Mr. Hancock responds. Then I'll provide commentary.
That's the first big question. Why did it take so long? And that raises in my mind a hypothesis, a possibility. Maybe it didn't take so long. Maybe things were happening that we haven't yet got hold of in the archaeological record, which await to be discovered. And of course, there are huge parts of the world that have not been studied at all by archaeology.
Yeah.
But the fact that huge parts of the world have not been studied at all by archaeology is not on its own enough to suggest that we're missing a chapter in the human story.
Well, of course, I mean, the things absolutely happened that we haven't got a clue of, because this is before history, and therefore there is no historiography that goes that way, because people weren't writing down things. And I think that that's the part that I'm really looking forward to see how he addresses, because basically, if this ancient, advanced Ice Age civilization occurred before 12,000 years ago. So imagine that this happened 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. There was this incredibly advanced civilization. Even if we don't talk about, I don't know if he talks about like modernly advanced with modern tech, or if he's saying they had reached the level of the Roman Empire. I haven't got a clue. We'll find this out today, I suppose. But even if it's the latter, that would mean that before prehistory, there was history. Because if a civilization is advanced, they have to have figured out a system of writing, which makes it by definition history. My question then would be, where did everything go? Where are all the written texts? Where are all the statues and the inscriptions, the stelae, the murals, the walls? Now, given, if I imagine his answer to that would be the cataclysmic event, the civilization ending impact that would have destroyed everything, but this stuff would still be somewhere underground. So if this did happen, it is important to consider that we would be saying that there was history before prehistory. So history, prehistory, history, we went back, if you will. That's a fascinating thought.
The reason that I come to that isn't only puzzlement about that 300,000-year gap. It's also to do with the fact that there's common iconography, there's common myths and traditions, and there's common spiritual ideas that are found all around the world. They're found amongst cultures that are geographically distant from one another, and that are also distant from one another in time. They don't necessarily occur at the same time. And this is where I think that archaeology is perhaps desperately needing a history of ideas as well as just a history of things.
Fair.
Because an idea can manifest again and again throughout the human story. So there are particular issues. For example, the notion of the afterlife destiny of the soul. What happens to us when we die? And believe me, when you reach my age, that's something you do think about. What happens? I used to feel immortal when I was in my 40s, but now that I'm 74, I definitely know that I'm not. Well, it would be natural for human beings all around the world to have that same feeling, that same idea.
Yeah.
But why would they all decide that what happens to the soul after death is that it makes a leap to the heavens, to the Milky Way, that it makes a journey along the Milky Way, that there it is confronted by challenges, by monsters, by closed gates. The course of the life that person has lived will determine their destiny in that afterlife journey. And this idea, the path of souls, the Milky Way is called the path of souls. It's very strongly found in the Americas, right from South America through Mexico, through into North America, but it's also found in ancient Egypt, in ancient India, in ancient Mesopotamia, the same idea. And I don't feel that can be a coincidence. I feel that what we're looking at is an inheritance of an idea, a legacy that's been passed down from a remote common source to cultures all around the world, and then has taken on a life of its own within those cultures. So the remote common source would explain both the similarities and the differences in the expression of these ideas. Let
me process that. Okay, so we are going into a little bit of mythology, a little bit of history of religion. So this is going to be actually more interesting than I thought. It's just even beyond the concept of archaeology. And he does have a point in the sense that there is symmetry in mythological and religious narratives all over the world. I myself made a video recently on Sodom and Gomorrah where we actually looked at the very similar way in which the events were described both in the biblical record and in the ancient Akkadian myths. There's a similar situation with the flood, with the idea of creation, like Adam and Eve, the idea of a savior. All of these are found in all sorts of different civilizations, separated by space and time, as he's saying. So what he's stating now is real. It's evident, and it does happen. So what we really are discussing in this situation is whether or not the convergent genesis of these sacred narratives happened by chance, or if they happened because there was a common denominator. Of course, even if there is a common denominator, that wouldn't still necessarily be proof of a technologically advanced civilization. But of course, I would say step by step. If you could already prove that there is a connection throughout time and throughout space over a large expanse of land within our planet, and you were able to prove that, for instance, all of these different places were colonies of the same civilization, worldwide civilization at this point, that would already be an amazing feat. Well, we'll see if he has something stronger, but this is fascinating indeed.
Very puzzling thing is this sequence of numbers that are a result of the precession of the equinoxes. At least I think that's the best theory to explain them. Here, I think it's important to pay tribute to the work of Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschend. Giorgio de Santillana was professor of history of science actually at MIT, where you're based, back in the 60s. And Hertha von Deschend was professor of the history of science at Frankfurt University. And they wrote an immense book in the 1960s called Hamlet's Mill. And Hamlet's Mill...
An essay of myth and the frame of time. That is a beautiful subtitle.
Differs very strongly from established opinion on the issue of the phenomenon of precession, and I'll explain what precession is in a moment. Generally, it's held that it was the Greeks who discovered the precession. And the dating on that is put back not very far, maybe 2,300 years ago or so. Santillana and von Deschend are pointing out that knowledge of precession is much, much older than that, thousands of years older than that, and they do actually trace it, I think I'm quoting them pretty much correctly, to some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization. Reading that book was one of the several reasons that I got into this mystery in the first place. Okay, now, the precession of the equinoxes, to give it its full name, results from the fact that our planet is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars. And our planet, of course, is rotating on its own axis at roughly 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. But what's less obvious is that it's also wobbling on its axis. And so if you imagine the extended north pole of the Earth pointing up at the sky, in our time, it's pointing at the star Polaris, and that is our pole star. But Polaris has not always been the pole star, precisely because of this wobble on the axis of the Earth. Other stars have occupied the pole position, and sometimes the extended north pole of the Earth points at empty space. There is no pole star. That's one of the obvious results of the wobble on the Earth's axis. The other one is that there are 12 well-known constellations in our time, the 12 constellations of the zodiac, that lie along what is referred to as the path of the sun. The Earth is orbiting the sun, and we are seeing what's behind it, what's in direct line with the sun in our view. And the zodiacal constellations all lie along the path of the sun. So at different times of the year, the sun will rise against the background of a particular zodiacal constellation. Today we live in the age of Pisces, and it's definitely not an accident that the early Christians used the fish as their symbol. This is another area where I differ from archaeology. I think the constellations of the zodiac were recognized as such much earlier than we suppose. Anyway, to get to the point, the key marker of the year, certainly in the northern hemisphere, was the spring equinox. The question was, what constellation is rising behind the sun? What constellation is housing the sun at dawn on the spring equinox?
I love that phrasing. What constellation is housing the sun, because they're in the path of the light. That's very interesting.
Right now it's Pisces. In another 150 years or so, it'll be Aquarius. We do live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Back in the time of the late ancient Egyptians, it was Aries, going back to the time of Ramesses or before. Before that, it was Taurus, and so on and so forth. It's backwards through the zodiac until 12,500 years ago, you come to the age of Leo, when the constellation of Leo houses the sun on the spring equinox. Now, this process unfolds very, 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 very slowly. The whole cycle, and it is a cycle, it repeats itself roughly every 26,000 years. Put a more exact figure on it, 25,920 years. That may be a convention. Some scholars would say it was a bit less than that, a bit more, but you're talking fractions. It's in that area, 25,920 years. And to observe it, you really need more than one human lifetime, because it...
Okay, so it's a matter of, I imagine, accumulated knowledge, as we were discussing in the previous episode.
Folds very, very slowly at a rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And parallel that I often give is hold your finger up to the horizon, the distant horizon. The movement in one lifetime, in a period of 72 years, is about the width of your finger. It's not impossible to notice in a lifetime, but it's difficult. You've got to pass it on. And what seems to have happened is that some ancient culture, the culture that Santayana and von Deschen call some almost unbelievable ancestor culture, worked out the entire process of precession and selected the key numbers of precession, of which the most important number, the governing number, is the number 72. But we also have,
like the wings of Metatron,
numbers related to the number 72. 72 plus 36 is 108. 108 divided by 2 is 54. These numbers are also found in mythology all around the world. There were 72 conspirators who were involved in killing the god Osiris in ancient Egypt and nailing him up in a wooden coffin.
I understand. It is a fascinating thing that he's saying. I find it very, very intriguing. But how do we know that these numbers that we find, as he says, in all sorts of different mythological stories are in fact related to the interpretation of the constellation, the zodiac, and the housing of the light of the sun? And mind you, I'm not necessarily trying to debunk this point, because I haven't got a clue. Maybe he is correct, and there was a common astronomical understanding that was the basis, that laid the basis of mankind's fixation with numbers. However, I'm trying to attack this now intellectually, the argument, simply because I want to see how kind of foolproof is. That is the best way to verify an argument, is to attack it. It is a fact that as humans, we do have a sort of innate drive towards numbers and their meaning. Sometimes this meaning is real and it's connected to actual events or even fundamental laws of physics. At the end of the day, reality is a mathematical structure. However, other times the meaning that we give to numbers may be a complete construct of our minds. And the reason why I say that is because at the end of the day, as humans, we have a propensity for pattern recognition. It's why we see faces everywhere. It's why sometimes, even if music doesn't align perfectly, it still does in your mind. With that being said, I do want to give credit where credit is due when it comes to the possible validity of the theory, or the hypothesis in this case, and that is on the basis of ancient intuition. That is, that understanding that ancient people had when it comes to astronomy and, of course, their mathematical relationship with numbers, also not just in the context of science, but also in the context of religion, theology, ancient mythologies and their traditions. Numbers are everywhere. The Bible is full of numbers. How much evidence do we have that these numerical patterns in connection with cosmic cycles are in fact connected to the same numbers that just happen to occur, theories presented by otherwise unrelated people? Because that's the crux of the discussion here.
And dumping him in the Nile. There are 432,000 in the Rig Vesa. 432,000 is a multiple of 72, and at Angkor in Cambodia.
There are so many multiples of 72, though. So that to me means nothing. Just because it's a multiple of 72, you know how many multiples of 72, like literally, you can just pick at that point. Like, look, write the whole list of all the possible multiples of 72, and then the moment you find one in an ancient civilization, you say, that's connection with 72. Not necessarily. That one is very weak. Let's see if he has something better.
For example, you have the bridge to Angkor Thom, and on that bridge you have figures on both sides, sculpted figures, which are holding the body of a serpent. That serpent is Vasuki, and what they're doing is they're churning the Milky Ocean. It's the same metaphor of churning and turning that's defined in the story of Hamlet's mill, of Amlodi's mill. There are 54 on each side. 54 plus 54 is 108. 108 is 72 plus 36. It's a precessional number, according to the work that Santayana and von Deschen did. And the fascination with this number system and its discovery all around the world is one of the puzzles that intrigue me and suggest to me that we are looking at ancestral knowledge that was passed down, and probably was passed down from a specific single common source.
like, I love the whole thing he said about the Milky Way being a path that we humans have to go through eventually to go back to the stars and all that. It's wonderful, but how does he make the connection between where is the bridge, the connection between the numbers occurring and the ancestral lost civilization? I imagine it has to be something deeper than, well, they have this in common, even though it happens at massive different times between these different regions.
At one time, but then was spread out very, very widely around the world.
So one of the defining ways that you approach the study of human history that I think contrasts with mainstream archaeology is you take this sort of astronomical symbolism and the relationship between humans and the stars very seriously.
I do.
Sure,
as I
yeah,
believe the ancients
fair.
did.
I think it's important
Sure.
to sort of consider what humans would have thought about back then. Now we have a lot of distractions. We have social media. We can watch videos on YouTube.
a good
and
point, yeah.
whatever. But back then, especially before sort of electricity, the stars is like
Yeah.
the sexiest thing to talk about.
There's no light pollution.
There's no light pollution, so that's
There's
and
the
you're
majesty
spending
of the heavens.
every single night. You're spending looking up at the stars, and you can imagine there's a lot of
Yeah, a lot of ancient people went to bed way earlier than we do, but it is still a good point.
sort of status value to be the guy who's very good at studying the stars.
Yeah.
And sort of the scientists of the day.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's going to be these geniuses that emerge
Yeah.
that are able to do two things. One, tell stories about the gods or whatever based on the stars. And then also, as we'll probably talk about, use the stars practically for navigation, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like, it makes sense that the stars had a primal importance
Yeah.
for the ideas of the times, for the status, for religious explorations.
It was an ever-present reality.
Yes.
And it was bright, and it was brilliant.
Yeah.
And it was full of lights.
Yeah.
It's inconceivable that the ancients would not have paid attention to it.
Well, of course, it makes sense. Absolutely. I don't even know if anyone would argue against that point. But yeah, sure. It's a lot of the times, you have a lot of different deities and gods throughout human history, but the sky gods are always the ones that I think are the prevalent one. Even when we look like at Akkadian religion, yeah, it's the gods that are in the sky. There are gods underneath the ground as well, but they run away when the sky gods arrive. So there is that.
It was an overwhelming presence, and that's one of the reasons why I'm really confident that the constellations that we now recognize as the constellations of the zodiac were recognized much earlier, because it's hard to miss when you pay attention to the sky that the sun, over the course of the solar year, is month by month rising against the background of different constellations. And then there's a much longer process, the process of precession, which takes that journey backwards, and where we have a period of 2,160 years.
Well, yeah, of course, and this is very Earth-centric, if you will, as he did explain earlier on, because clearly the pattern that we see as we look up the sky and we recognize, and then the ancients had this sort of imaginary construct of the mind, whereby that looks like a bull, so Taurus, and that one looks like twins, so Gemini, and that one looks like Aries, and all that, Aquarius. Of course, all of that is arbitrary, because these stars are so distant within the three-dimensional space that those connecting lines don't even make sense unless you look at them from an Earth perspective. But of course, the Earth perspective is rather two-dimensional, and that's how we create these shapes. But would an ancient civilization have come up with the same shapes? Well, I think his position is that they were the ones that came up with it, and then the Greeks, the Romans, and all the others are just repeating something that was already made beforehand, which is interesting. And I say, hey, great, if you can prove it, I'd love that.
For each sign of the zodiac. I think it would have been hard for the ancients to have missed that. They might not have identified the constellations in exactly the same way we do today. That may well be a Babylonian or Greek convention. But that the constellations were there, I think, was very clear, and that they were special constellations, unlike other ones higher up in the sky, which were not on the path of the sun, that people paid attention to.
Well, but detecting the precession of the equinox is hard, because especially they don't have any writing systems, they don't have any
No, that's the
mathematical
part.
systems. So
That's the part that I think he's trying to present, Lex. They don't if they are prehistoric. But what basically this gentleman is, I think, purporting here is that we start as humans in a prehistorical sense. Then, about like, say, 200,000 years ago, we reach history. We start writing. We have astronomy. We have advanced technology. Once again, I don't know if he means an Xbox or if he means steel, bronze. Regardless, we have a civilization, and then they fall because of a cataclysmic event, that, if I'm not misunderstanding him, and we regress back to the Stone Age, and then we have the beginning of we rediscover it again. So they would not be prehistoric, and they would have all of those if this is a lost civilization. That's why we call it a civilization. They would be historical at that point.
so everything is told through words.
Yeah, they have. Let's not underestimate oral traditions.
I wonder why he's going that way. If they are advanced, they are historical. If they are advanced and the power to influence all sorts of different areas in the globe, they don't need to rely on oral traditions. That is, I think that would be a I don't know if I'm misunderstanding something here, but I think they're saying two different things at this point.
Oral traditions, that's something we've lost in our culture today. One of the things that happens with the written word is that you gradually lose your memory. Actually, there's a nice story from ancient Egypt about the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, who is very proud of himself because he has invented writing. Look at this gift, he says to a mythical pharaoh of that time. Look at the gift that I am giving humanity, writing. This is a wonderful thing. It'll enable you to preserve so much that you would otherwise lose. And the pharaoh in this story replies to him, no, you have not given us a wonderful gift. You have destroyed the art of memory. We will forget everything. Words will roam free around the world, not accompanied by any wise advice.
Well, then I agree with the god, honestly, not the pharaoh.
Set them into context. And actually, that's a very interesting point. And
I still agree with the god.
we do know that cultures that still do have oral traditions are able to preserve information for very long periods of time. One thing I think is clear in any time, in any period of history, is human beings love stories. We love great stories. And one way to preserve information is to encode it, embed it in a great story. And so carefully done that actually it doesn't matter whether the storyteller knows that they're passing on that information or not. The story itself is the vehicle, and as long as it's repeated faithfully, the information contained within it will be passed on.
And that's lovely, but it's still a objectively inferior method of information storage at a societal level as opposed to the written word and the written record. Like, there is no discussion about this. It's not even an item of controversy. It is what it is. These people that he's mentioning, well, no, there are some tribes that they don't use the written word and they have very good memory with their stories. Great, but they don't make iPhones. They don't make iPhones, and militarily we could wipe them out. We don't, because we choose not to. It's strange now to me, because even though the whole introduction with the numbers and the comment section was very interesting, and I'm open to that, it appears now that after Lex's commentary, he seems to be defending the idea that this advanced Ice Age civilization that he's discussing wouldn't have the writings as a tech, which puzzles me now. He says puzzled by them, but I'm puzzled by him. I'm puzzled by the theory. Now we'll see if he changes that, but if they were just based on oral tradition, and they were indeed prehistorical in the sense that they didn't have any writing ability, are they even a civilization? Would be my question.
I do think this is part of the story of the preservation of knowledge.
So that's one of the reasons that you take myths seriously.
I take them very seriously, and the other, many reasons, but I can't help being deeply impressed and deeply puzzled by the worldwide tradition of a global cataclysm within human memory.
That's true.
We know that we know scientifically that there have been many, many cataclysms in the past, going back millions of years. I mean, the
Yeah.
best known one, of course, is the KPG event, as it's now called, that made the dinosaurs extinct 65 million or 66 million years ago. But has there been such a cataclysm in the lifetime of the human species? Yeah, the Mount Toba eruption about 70,000 years ago was pretty bad. But a global cataclysm, the Younger Dryas, really ticks all the boxes as a worldwide disaster. Which
I am very open to the possibility of a massive cataclysmic event, which is what I was actually presenting. Although my idea was more localized rather than global, but the idea of the collective memory embedded in scripture and embedded in religious traditions throughout the world of an impact event is absolutely present in all sorts of different unrelated civilizations, or even civilizations that are close when it comes to space, but not time. And I do go into the details of this, what this impact event could have been in my video Sodom and Gomorrah. I mentioned it several times because it seems to be very pertinent to this. A global extinction level cataclysm, I mean, something like that, if it happened within the time span in which humans existed, I think it would have remained in our collective memory. Absolutely. So that I'm very open to the possibility that something like that actually happened within our lifetimes as a species.
definitely involved sea level rise, both at the beginning and at the end of
Which
the
would be the
Dryas.
flood,
It
which
definitely
could be the
involved
flood,
the swallowing up of lands that previously had been above water. And I think it's an excellent candidate for this worldwide tradition of a global cataclysm, of which one of, but not the only, distinguishing characteristics was a flood, an enormous flood, and the submergence of lands that had previously been above water, underwater. The fact that this story is found all around the world suggests to me that the archaeological explanation is, look, people suffer local floods all the time. I mean, as we're talking, there's flooding in Florida, but I don't think anybody in Florida is going to make the mistake of believing that that's a global flood. They know it's local.
Yeah.
But that's the argument largely of archaeology dealing with the flood myths, or that some local population experienced a nasty local flooding event, and they decided to say that it affected the whole world. I'm not persuaded by that, particularly since we know there was a nasty epoch, the Younger Dryas, when flooding did occur and when the Earth was subjected to events cataclysmic enough to extinguish entirely the megafauna of the Ice Age.
That is wonderfully put. I really like this section. And I have to say, now I've been making, let me change the camera for a second. I have been producing an episode specifically dedicated to the common appearances of the idea of a global flood or a deluge throughout several different ancient traditions, Akkadian, biblical, and a few others. It's just that these episodes take me quite a bit of time to be put together, but I have been working on it. And I really, really do appreciate the fact that there can be absolutely a connection between what's been passed down through religion, myth, culture, if you will, throughout the world in ancient times, Bronze Age, and even earlier than that, and what actually occurred at a physical level. I do notice that whenever I make episodes on the Bible, even though I try to stay as scholarly as possible, as secular as possible, I'm a Christian, but I try not to let that, my own personal bias, influence the way I present information. So I always try to present information in the most neutral way possible, just looking at the languages, the culture, the meaning, the possible connections, Still, I do get people, like when I talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, when I talk about the creation of Adam and Eve, they always come in the comments and say, oh, that's all just nonsense. It's biblical myths. Why do you even bother talking about these? No, I think that's a wrong approach. Because even if you are the most atheists or militant atheist on the planet, which would be your choice, and I would respect that, and you don't believe in divine intervention, and you don't believe in the religious connotations that are given to any of these events that have alleged happened, you can still take into consideration that maybe the ancients were referring to something that did happen. And then from your point of view, they would have added a religious explanation to it. And I mean, at the end of the day, how strange is that to really consider? If you are a Bronze Age civilization, and then at one point a lightning strikes and hits trees and the whole forest goes on fire, and then that fire connects to half of the city and it burns the farmland, how weird would it be to imagine that a Bronze Age people thought that that was a punishment by the gods? Maybe something did happen. Now, the simple fact that as an atheist, you would dismiss that as being, well, yeah, they believed that it was the gods, but it wasn't. It was just natural occurring. It doesn't mean that the fire didn't happen, though. It doesn't prove that the lightning didn't strike. That could still absolutely have happened, even if we were to remove every single possible religious connotation from it. Now, again, as a Christian man, I don't remove those, but I do remove them from my presentations, and I love to just look at it, not from my perspective, but from the perspective of the people of the time. But it is important to still consider the possibility that a massive flood did occur worldwide. And just because we get this from scripture or religions, many different religions throughout the world, it shouldn't automatically be dismissed as, oh, that's just mythology. Because a lot of mythology and a lot of religion comes directly from real experience that did happen and people were trying to explain. So I did appreciate this point very much.
So there is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis that provides an explanation of what happened during this period that resulted in such rapid environmental change. So can you explain this hypothesis?
Yeah,
please.
The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, YDIH for short, is not a lunatic fringe theory, as its opponents often attempt to write it off. It's the work of more than 60 major scientists working across many different disciplines, including archaeology and including oceanography as well. They are collectively puzzled by the sudden onset of the Younger Dryas and by the fact that it is accompanied 12,800 years ago by a distinct layer in the earth. You can see it most clearly at Murray Springs in Arizona, for example. You can see it's about the width of a human hand, and there's a draw there that's been cut by flash flooding at some time, and that draw has revealed the sides of the draw, and you can see the cross section, and in the cross section is this distinct dark layer that runs through the earth, and it contains evidence of wildfires. There's a lot of soot in it. There are also nanodiamonds in it. There is shocked quartz in it. There is quartz that's been melted at temperatures in excess of 2,200 degrees centigrade. There are carbon microspherules.
No fire could reach those temperatures for sure.
All of these are proxies for some kind of cosmic impact. I talked a moment ago about the extinction of the dinosaurs. Lewis and Walter Alvarez, who made that incredible discovery, initially their discovery was based entirely on impact proxies, just as the Younger Dryas is. There was no crater, and for a long time they were disbelieved because they couldn't produce a crater. But when they finally did produce that deeply buried Chicxulub crater, that's when people started to say, yeah, they have to be right. But they weren't relying on the crater. They were relying on the impact proxies. And they're the same impact proxies that we find in what's called the Younger Dryas boundary layer all around the world. So it's the fact that at the moment when the Earth tips into a radical climate shift, it's been warming up for at least 2,000 years before 12,800 years ago. People at the time must have been feeling a great sense of relief. You know, we've been living through this really cold time, but it's getting better. Things are getting better. And then suddenly around 12,800 years ago, some might say 12,860 years ago, there's a massive global plunge in global temperatures, and the world suddenly gets as cold as it was at the peak of the Ice Age. And it's almost literally overnight. It's very, very, very rapid.
Seriously.
Normally, in an epoch when the Earth is going into a freeze, you would not expect sea levels to rise. But there is a sea level rise, a sudden one, right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. And then you have this long frozen period from 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. And then equally dramatically and equally suddenly, the Younger Dryas comes to an end and the world very rapidly warms up, and you have a recognized pulse of meltwater at that time as the last of the glaciers collapse into the sea, called Meltwater Pulse 1b, around about 11,600 years ago. So this is a period which is very tightly defined. It's a period when we know that human populations were grievously disturbed. That's when the so-called Clovis culture of North America vanished entirely from the record during the Younger Dryas, and it's the time when the mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers vanished from the record as well.
Is there a good understanding of what happened geologically, whether there was an impact or not? Like, what explains this huge dip in temperature and then rise in temperature?
The abrupt cessation of the global meridional overturning circulation, of which the Gulf Stream is the best known part. The main theory that's been put forward up to now, and I don't dispute that theory at all, is that the sudden freeze was caused by the cutting off of the Gulf Stream, basically, which is part of the central heating system of our planet. So no wonder it became cold. But what's not really been addressed before is why that happened, why the Gulf Stream was cut, why a sudden pulse of meltwater went into the world ocean, and it was so much of it, and it was so cold that it actually stopped the Gulf Stream in its tracks. And that's where the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis offers a very elegant and very satisfactory solution.
That is incredible. I mean, I love that. Very, very absolutely. The idea of a global cosmic event, like an asteroid, I imagine, or some kind of celestial body that just hits the planet that causes all this, is absolutely reasonable. And as he says, and as I was mentioning on my video that I mentioned before, we do have remnants of this collective memory. And if the geological data and the analysis reveals the effects of such a incredible temperature that otherwise wouldn't be explained, I think it becomes a strong hypothesis. Still an hypothesis, but a much stronger one.
To the problem. Now, the hypothesis, of course, is broader than that. Amongst the scientists working on it are, for example, Bill Napier, an astrophysicist and astronomer. They have assembled a great deal of evidence which suggests that the culprit in the Younger Dryas impact event or events was what we now call the torrid meteor stream, which the Earth still passes through twice a year. It's now about 30 million kilometers wide. It takes the Earth a couple of days to pass through it on its orbit. It passed through it in June, and it passes through it at the end of October. The suggestion is that the torrid meteor stream is the end product of a very large comet that entered the solar system round about 20,000 years ago, came in from the Oort cloud, got trapped by the gravity of the sun, and went into orbit around the sun, an orbit that crossed the orbit of the Earth. However, when it was one object, the likelihood of a collision with the Earth was extremely small.
Did it explode?
But as it started to do what all comets do, which was to break up into multiple fragments, because these are chunks of rock held together by ice, and as they warm up, they split and disintegrate and break into pieces. As it passed through that, its debris stream became larger and larger and wider. And the theory is that 12,800 years ago, the Earth passed through a particularly dense part of the torrid meteor stream and was hit by multiple impacts all around the planet, certainly from the west of North America as far east as Syria. And that we are by and large not talking about impacts that would have caused craters, although there certainly were some. We're talking about airbursts. When an object is 100 or 150 meters in diameter and it's coming in very fast into the Earth's atmosphere, it is very unlikely to reach the Earth. It's going to blow up in the sky. And the best known recent example of that is the Tunguska event in Siberia, which took place on the 30th of June, 1908. The Tunguska event was, nobody disputes, it was definitely an airburst of a cometary fragment. And the date is interesting because the 30th of June is the height of the beta Taurids. It's one of the two times when the Earth is going through the Taurid meteor stream. Well, luckily that part of Siberia wasn't inhabited, but 2,000 square miles of forest were destroyed. If that had happened over a major city, we would all be thinking very hard about objects out of the Taurid meteor stream and about the risk of cosmic impact.
Absolutely. That is the perspective, subjective approach to this that we humans have. I mean, at the end of the day, now that he mentioned this, I remember a movie mentioning it. And a movie that I really liked, can't remember the name now, but yeah, I remember a movie mentioning this, and I thought it was fascinating, but then I forgot all about it. Now that he mentioned it, I'm like, oh yeah, now it kind of rings the bell. But of course, if this had happened over a city, like he's saying, or a highly populated area, and it caused, incalculable destruction and loss of human life, I do believe we would all know about it, which would also connect to the idea as to why certain events may go through centuries and millennia being told, whether it be through the religious spectrum or whether it be through scientific spectrum, educational system, because they impact us closer than others. I do believe a flood would be one of these, particularly if it caused the loss of human life and destruction of urban centers. If it happened in a remote area, probably wouldn't have. So it kind of strengthens this idea that it's probably not a local occurring.
So the suggestion is that it wasn't one impact, it wasn't two impacts, it wasn't three impacts, it was hundreds of airbursts all around the planet, coupled with a number of bigger objects, which the scientists working on this think hit the North American ice cap largely. Some of them may also have hit the Northern European ice cap, resulting in that sudden, otherwise unexplained flood of meltwater that went into the world ocean, and caused the cooling that then took place. But this was a disaster for life all over the planet. And it's
Sure.
interesting that one of the sites where they find the Younger Dryas boundary and where they find overwhelming evidence of an airburst and where they find all the shocked quartz, the carbon microspherules, the nanodiamonds, the trinitite, and so on and so forth, all of those impact proxies are found at Abu Herrera. That was a settlement within 150 miles of Göbekli Tepe, and it was hit 12,800 years ago, and it was...
Göbekli Tepe being the archaeological Stone Age discovery that we talked about in the previous episode, which contained the first two sections of this. So if you're not familiar with that, I would refer to either go and watch the full podcast, of course. We don't watch it all at once, so that is also a sort of little bit of a stimulus for people to go and watch it on the original channel. But at the end of the day, he's connecting to what we discussed in the previous episode.
Obliterated. Interestingly, it was re-inhabited by human beings within probably 5 years, but it was completely obliterated at that time. And it's difficult to imagine that the people who lived in that area would not have been very impressed by what they saw happening, by these massive explosions in the sky and the obliteration of Abu Herrera. Now, this is a theory. The Younger Dryas impact, it's a hypothesis, actually. It's not even a theory. A theory is, I think, considered a higher level than a hypothesis. That's why it's the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And of course, it has many opponents, and there are many who disagree with it. And there have been a series of peer-reviewed papers that have been published supposedly debunking the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. One, I think, was in 2011. It was called a requiem for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And
I'd like to underline there is nothing wrong with that. Like, don't look at this as, oh, they're trying to debunk it, so they are haters. That's not how academia works. That's why I'm always open to people making debunking videos towards me. Although, again, unfortunately, some of the people that do that, they just do ad hominem attacks and insult me, so they're not really debunking anything I'm saying, are they? It's just that they're using a misnomer in that case. But when it's people that are respectful and they just attack my arguments, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. You know how many people tried to debunk Einstein? You know how many people tried to debunk and attacked the quantum physics when it first came out? It's just the way it works. You are supposed to attack a theory. and an hypothesis. Because the moment you attack it, it means that you're at least giving it enough space in your mind to consider it a possibility. And that's why you try to then verify it or criticize it. And as anyone who presents an hypothesis, a theory, a study, an idea, perception, you should want it to be attacked if the truth is what you want to reach. This isn't a matter of, oh, I'm offended. Oh, no, I'm attacking you. Oh, you're attacking me. How? Not how it works.
There's one just been published a few months ago or a year ago, called a complete refutation of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, something like that, some lengthy title. So it's a hypothesis that has its opponents.
Yeah.
And even within those of us who are looking at the alternative side of history, there are different points of view. Robert Schoch from Boston University, the geologist who demonstrated that the erosion on the Sphinx may well have been caused by exposure to a long period of very heavy rainfall. He doesn't go for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. He fully accepts that the Younger Dryas was a global cataclysm and that the extinctions took place, but he thinks it was caused by some kind of massive solar outburst. So what everybody's
well, that one is wow. I mean, prop to him. That's another really, really compelling argument as well. Could you imagine that? That'd be incredible.
Agreed on is the Younger Dryas was bad.
Okay.
But there is dispute about what caused it. I personally have found the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis to be the most persuasive.
With the comets.
Which most effectively explains all the evidence.
How important is the impact hypothesis to your understanding of the ice age?
Well, okay, this was an absolutely wonderful episode, and I really, really liked it. So the first one was good, was a little intriguing. But this, with the whole situation with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, I have to say is where we really started to get into the meat and bones of this. Now, we are sort of opening a new chapter now with Lex specifically asking the professor, okay, now that we have discussed, explained what this Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is, how strong of an impact does it have onto the theory of the advanced ice age, a prehistorical civilization then, of course, Graham Hancock is proposing. And I think that would be a fantastic beginning for an episode 3, so that we can kind of see how he connects them. And then we would move on to the next section, which would be the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx of Giza. Yeah, so if you're interested in this, if you want me to continue the series, as always, leave a comment, let me know. And thanks to Lex Fridman and to Graham Hancock for providing such an entertaining, fascinating episode full of food for thought. But thank you very much for watching, Noble Ones, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. And remember, the Metatron has spread his 72 wings. Goodbye.